Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jan Ślewiński. Ukraine has regained initiative in its war against Russia, plunging illegally occupied Crimea into chaos as Ukrainian drone strikes continue to paralyze the region's logistics. At the recent G7 summit, there seemed to be a general recognition of a change in the war's dynamics, with US President Donald Trump promising a tougher stance on Russia to force it to the negotiating table. But even as Ukraine's military achievements continue to impress, what is next for the conflict, and is a potential resolution anywhere in sight? Joining us here today to discuss this is Stepan Rusyn, Program Coordinator at the Transatlantic Dialogue Center. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So a while ago, Russia has introduced us to the concept of goodwill gesture by giving away control of Izmailny Island. Do you think we're in for a much bigger goodwill gesture in Crimea, given what has been happening there recently?
I'm afraid it's too early to speak about this. As of now, we for sure have been using the element of surprise and tactics, using our middle strike drones that the Russians are not prepared to counter, and that materializes in what we are now seeing in the occupied Crimea and southern regions of Ukraine. But most likely, as it usually happened in this war, over 2-3 months, one of the sides find an effective countermeasure. So the Ukrainian way of thinking is that now, when Russians cannot do anything against those strikes, Ukraine has to do anything it could to maximize the damage that can be done in this very short window of opportunity.
Now, there have been comments from one person associated with the military, I remember, saying that FSB agents have been leaving Crimea, that there could be a sign that Russia might actually be losing control. And also, of course, we have the fuel crisis, we have routes leading to the peninsula being blocked or eliminated completely, like a few bridges have been hit. Do you think that Russia would be able to hold on to the peninsula if, for example, the Crimean bridge in the Kerch Strait is hit and put out of commission?
Russia has enough still alternative routes that can lead to Crimea and can mitigate the oil and petroleum crisis. And as well, the option of using ships is on the table as well. So I would not be too optimistic saying that Russia will completely lose control over the situation in Crimea, but for sure the tourist season will be out of question anymore, and for sure the population on the peninsula will be not very fond of how Putin and Russian government are handling the situation. So it may increase the pressure on the Russian government, and it will for sure have a negative impact on the Russian operations against Ukraine in the south.
So increasing pressure, but also increasing the cost of the war. There have been recent strikes on refineries all across Russia, sometimes hundreds of kilometers deep into Russian territory. Also military facilities like the Titan Barkady facility, which produces components for missile launchers, like the infamous Iskander. Now, do you think that at some point Russia will have to admit that this simply is too expensive an endeavor, and that this war is costing the Russian government too much to be sustained?
That's the way of the thinking, military strategy that Ukraine is pursuing, to show to the Russian leadership that the cost of war are unbearable, and to motivate them closer to autumn to start negotiations in good faith. At some point, well, one of part of this Ukrainian strikes is against military industry, and it will also limit Russia's capability to produce missiles that can then in winter target Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And the hope is that by the beginning of the cold season, the Russian calculation of possible risks of Ukrainian retaliation versus Russian capabilities to destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure will overweigh, and that in that case, Ukraine and Russia can start from, for example, energy infrastructure ceasefire, and then this can evolve in something bigger.
Do you think that the United States will now be permanently changing its position vis-à-vis the conflict? They used to try positioning themselves as a mediator, but now there are signals that Donald Trump and his administration are increasingly fed up with what they see as Vladimir Putin dragging his feet, pretending to negotiate, but then backing away, not doing anything to begin, as you said, talking, to Ukraine and its allies in good faith about ending the war. Do you think that this trend is likely to last?
First, the United States is still very much preoccupied with the Iran war, and I don't see them coming actively to the Ukrainian-Russian track before the Iran war is fully settled. And I would agree with you. Over the time, the American position has changed because the current administration got their first-hand experience in handling with the Russians. And although a lot have been offered by the American side, the Russians stayed on their maximalist position. So I would say that this change that we are witnessing now is more of a long term. I would not be overly optimistic, but hopefully we'll see that the United States, they continue support with intelligence, with providing their weapons via Plural initiatives. So this support will stay, and maybe even more will be coming upon the results of the upcoming NATO summit.
Speaking of the NATO summit, how do you think this is developing? Do you think that Europe has now recognized two things? First, that it does have to take advantage of lessons learned by Ukraine in order to change the way in which it is likely to approach a potential future conflict, but also that in addition to these lessons learned, it has to take responsibility to a much greater extent for its own security. Do you think that countries in Western Europe in particular are ready for this seismic shift in philosophy?
It's very difficult to speak for all of the Western European countries. Some of them really have shown their readiness to invest more and to take more responsibility. Some of them think that they are already okay from the perspective of their national security, of what they're investing already. I would say that for sure, there is understanding that you can learn from Ukraine, and this can be a mutually beneficial partnership that the Europeans can use for strengthening their own armed forces. As for the money question, I guess it will be one of the topics of the summit, whether the Europeans are really taking this 3.5 percentage or even 5.5 percentage target seriously, and whether there is going to be a real timetable how Americans will be withdrawing from Europe and how Europeans will be substituting those American assets with their own assets. But as of now, there is no timetable. There are only political promises, but we'll see at the summit whether there is a progress there.
Should we be concerned that Russia could see this as a window of opportunity, essentially seeing that there are certain gaps in deterrence, there are gaps in defense capabilities, and possibly using this for some sort of provocative action to also draw attention away from Ukraine, or to try and discourage European countries from sending their support to Kyiv? The horizontal escalation, that was the word that was recently used.
Yeah, they for sure can be tempted, because right now there is this gap between withdrawn American capabilities and not built yet European capabilities. And the Russians alluded to this recently in the relation to Ukrainian-Belarus tensions, that any hostile action by Ukrainians against Belarus will be interpreted as an opportunity for the Russians to also target any of Ukraine's NATO allies in response. So I guess European countries should be ready already right now to any possible provocation scenarios, and only strengths properly communicated to Russians can deter them from these steps.
So what would be the worst case scenario? Let's say there is some sort of provocative action or a false flag operation in one of the Baltic states. What would be the reaction that Moscow would want to see?
Russia would be very much interested in dissolving NATO. So if they carry out any kind of provocative action in, let's say, Baltic states, that will then does not imply any response by the US, that the United States will not interpret it as an Article 4 or Article 5 case. That would mean the end of NATO as alliance. And that's basically one of the main goals of the Russian foreign policy under Putin. And with the current administration, it's maybe a more tricky question, because the Biden administration was communicating very often that we are ready to defend every inch of the NATO territory. Now it's more Americans trying to persuade Europeans to take more responsibility for themselves. But I can see Russians trying to play with this ambiguity on the American side to achieve their goals.
So from a Ukrainian perspective and Ukrainian experience, I mean, back in 2014, there was a hybrid operation against Crimea. Little green man, Russia pretending it's not their troops, even though they were. From that experience, what would you say Baltic states, for example, should do if something like this happens? If all of a sudden there is a unit of troops in uniforms bearing no insignia and they start to wreak havoc?
Well, Ukrainian experience, I'm not sure if that's that much applicable for the Baltic states, given that in 2014, after the flee of the Ukrainian president, our state apparatus was pretty dysfunctional, and there could not have been any centralized counteraction by the Ukrainians. For sure, that should entail an increased presence of the police, military, government in the areas where the Russians may try this scenario, but it also entails work with the local population. And I'm pretty sure that they already do this, but this has to guarantee that no locals participate in this kind of provocations by the Russian green mans, or whatever we can call them.
And ensuring that the decision-making centers are functional. Like you implied, that, if something like this happens, decisions need to be made fast. Stepan Rusyn was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much for inviting.
And I'm Jonasz Rownicki. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.